Well, great. It's great to have you here with us today, Quintin, to share on our webinar. Look, I've known you for a few years now. We have not met in person. We've met virtually, and we share a common platform. We're part of both on the advisory board of the Freedom Business Alliance, and we didn't even know that when we first started connecting. Well, welcome today. Yeah, Sarah and I have known you and your wife Angela, and we've followed you, and in a sense, we've learned a lot from you in this space. So yeah, let me just hand it over to you just to explain who you are. If you want to introduce yourself and give more of a background to FiftyEight and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Stephen, and really great to join you from the UK. Opposite ends of the day, doing this, so it's always interesting. But yeah, just so grateful that you've asked me to join you. And so I'm Quintin Lake. As you say, my wife and I, Angela, are based in the UK. We live near Liverpool. I'm clearly not from there originally. Originally from much closer to you guys in New Zealand. But I've been here in the UK now for lots of years, and we must be about 7 years ago now. We set up FiftyEight as a way of helping organizations, companies, NGOs, organizations right across the value chain of companies look at working conditions and ultimately trying to aim towards good work and their workplaces across their supply chains. So we'll talk more about that as we go along, of course, but just really great to be with you this morning / afternoon.
Thank you. Yeah, it's yeah, look, we're really inspired by what you do, and we know you've done a lot in the space in the UK with the UK Modern Slavery Act, and you've formed some terrific partnerships. Yeah, maybe if you could just give us more insights into who FiftyEight is and what's the current work that you do. What's your business stand for?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, so FiftyEight, we ultimately our aim is quite simple, I guess, in a way, which is that people would have access to good work, work that's free from exploitation, and I guess that is why when we started in 2014, was off the back of lots of years of consulting with large companies around their broader corporate responsibility, sustainability strategies, but seeing more and more that companies were looking at looking at some of the challenges, I guess, around decent work in their supply chains and what they could do to address that. And so as we began, really our work is underpinned by research. So research is a huge part of what we do, looking at everything from good practice. So what if companies have been doing this for 15 or 20 years or more? What are they learning about what's working, what's really making an impact or making a difference in improving conditions in their supply chains? We do that mostly to be able to share good practice faster. But actually that kind of research get used in lots of different ways. So even informing actually Australia's Modern Slavery Act, when that was in the early stages of its discussion, those kind of things. So we really, I think our work is underpinned by, but we really love that part of research. And now it goes from that corporate leadership kind of research to looking at things like very, very in-depth at child labor, and looking specifically at where and how children at work, particularly in hazardous work. Just last week, the ILO published updated estimates of child labor globally, and unfortunately, the estimates are going up, partly due to COVID, mostly due to COVID, but also other impacts as well. And so, really trying to understand where and how child labor exists, what are the factors that lead to it, what are the potential ways that we can see children moving away from it more quickly. So that research is a big part of what we do, but then I guess our work also then looks at solutions that are driven by that research. So looking at the challenges people face and what can alternative solutions look like. So we'll talk a lot more about one of those today. And finally, sort of consulting and training, helping companies, particularly who are having to look at this issue for the first time through things like the UK or Australia's Modern Slavery Acts, helping them figure out what does this actually mean, what does modern slavery look like, and what does it really mean for my business. So
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. Now there's a few things that have come out of that. So my brain's sort of busy now trying to find it with all sorts of questions, but let's just go back to the research part, because this research for you is not just desk research. You're not just sitting in your office. You're not that you're in an Ivy Tower in Liverpool there, but you're not just sitting in your office. You've actually, it's very much primary research for yourself. You've actually gone into some places, particularly in Africa. So that's, that says to me that's really it can be quite intense. Can you maybe fill us in a little bit about that research that you've been doing? And that I gather has been disrupted by COVID, but what's some of the research that you've done in parts of Africa?
Yeah, for sure. Well, you're right that that kind of I guess practical research for us began even a long time before 58 began. So probably both for Angela and I since about 2003. I guess I've been visiting and trying to understand living and working conditions in lots of different parts of the world, and a lot of those experiences are part of what led to 58 beginning. Particularly more in Southeast Asia, but as you say, that's been more in Africa recently. So, for example, we, as part of our research into child labor, we've visited in Ethiopia, in DRC, in Central African Republic. That's particularly where that research is focused at the moment. And a lot of that just very practically looks like going and visiting, for example, communities in Eastern DRC where artisanal mining is the primary livelihood. The communities that are surrounded by a lot of armed conflict, where armed groups even are controlling any alternatives to mining. So all the agricultural lands, any of the kind of roads and other ways of in and out of these communities. So for somebody growing up there, I mean, they're phenomenally beautiful. Sort of, if you imagine the Swiss Alps and villages tucked up away in hillsides, you go and visit. It's exactly like that in Eastern DRC, but unfortunately, just ravaged by so much conflict and challenges like Ebola and other things over the years, that really for children and adults, long hard days digging with their hands. Digging coltan and tantalum, which go into all the kinds of products that we use every day, into our phones, into our laptops, into our solar, all those kind of things. That's what their day looks like in day out. So a big part of our research is trying to seeing that firsthand, understanding from their stories what they would want to see different, how that could be different, and trying to bring that learning back to companies and investors and others that we work with here in the UK and elsewhere.
Yeah. So with that research, I mean, do you think that's having an impact on corporate UK in terms of how companies are thinking? Is that sort of gaining traction, I suppose, with companies?
Yeah, so I mean, it's always I think understanding impact around what's practically changing for companies is a really challenging thing. But there's definitely from the main thing that we have to go on is their stories, or what they tell us about what this is maybe doing or sparking for them, and certainly with investors and with those in companies who are responsible with due diligence in their supply chains. Telling us it really is having impacting their thinking about the way they undertake due diligence. It's really, when you get to that stage of supply chains, especially with something like coltan or tantalum, that is just one of the first, finding the mineral at its source, where then it's so much later as it gets passed through lots of different traders and stages in the supply chain that it's actually going into these products. Really difficult for companies to carry out that due diligence from down through their supply chain, and so the kind of those on the ground insights companies are telling us it's really helping them to think differently about where the issues exist and who they might work with to try and address them, and trying to target that more quickly.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Wow, that's yeah, well, that's very important work, and I imagine very intense work as well, to go into those kind of contexts. Now, obviously, some of that work has been disrupted by COVID, in terms of you being able to travel. How have you been able to continue tracking, yeah, the situation in parts of the DRC, for example?
Yeah, so that I think comes down entirely to the kind of the partnerships and the people that we're able to work with. So actually, that research we undertake as part of a partnership called PACE, the Partnership Against Child Exploitation, and that's made up of organizations like ourselves, but also NGOs, World Vision and War Child, that they've been in these communities, lived and worked there day in, day out, for years, and will continue doing so for years. They're deeply committed to the communities where they work. And so during COVID, those relationships, those working closely with those teams on the ground, also researchers from Columbia University, they run a child protection center. So having those local relationships, those local connections, is really the only way during something like COVID to continue that research. And we worked with a locally based consultancy in Ethiopia who continued their research right throughout COVID last year. Lots of different challenges that created for them logistically and otherwise. They had to change the way they were undertaking their research, all those kind of things. But yeah, that's really we're so grateful for those relationships, those partnerships, and I think it's a picture really of the only way that we see that something like modern slavery can be addressed is through those partnerships and working closely together.
Sure. I mean that collaborating, finding partnerships, that's very much on our heart as Unchained, and we really see the value of that. Of course, there is a role for technology to play in all this, and you also have a tech component to FiftyEight. What role does technology play in helping to improve traceability or transparency, or really bring, I suppose, shed a light on all that is happening and to bring about some improvements?
I think that's a good way, is through shedding a light primarily. I think technology is, I guess, the nature of modern slavery, or of often of exploitation, in any form really, is that it is it's self-serving. It's in its own interest to keep it hidden, to keep it quiet, to use things like technology to and whether it's through the dark web or using different networks to connect with people and attract them to a job overseas, or whatever that looks like. So I think technology often can be used for bad, and something like modern slavery, but it also has this incredible potential to shed a light and to create better connections, better pathways. For us, I think we see particularly shortening the distance between what happens in communities like in the DRC or in smallholder farming in Ethiopia, the distance between that and the rest of their industry, and between the companies and boardrooms often that have more influence over their industry. So helping take the conditions and what needs to change, and then better understanding what is changing. So impact, like you said, I think technology has a huge role to play in identifying problems, helping better address them, and then better understand the impact.
Okay. Well, you've got your own piece of tech that you've developed in collaboration with others, called JustGoodWork. Just before we go into the details of that application, can you tell us maybe, how did you came to develop JustGoodWork, and what you really want to achieve out of this application?
Yeah, for sure. So, so maybe the easiest way is just telling you a little bit of the where it came from. And so when we were undertaking some of that research I was talking about on corporate best practice, looking at modern slavery and supply chains, we were trying to see what was working so others could do better faster. But while there was lots of good stuff that was emerging, what was really, I think from every company we spoke to actually talked about the primary challenge they were finding, or the main way they were identifying exploitation in their supply chains, were issues for migrant workers that had happened in the recruitment process. So where people have been given misinformation, deliberately deceived, charged excessive fees, whatever that might have looked like. But their factories, their CSR teams, all the primary issues they were grappling with stemmed back to issues that had happened in the recruitment process. And they said, the thing is, the challenges that migrant workers are facing, like that's it's where we see the most challenge, but it's also where we have the least visibility or the least ability to do anything to really tackle that. It starts to get really complex in terms of the number of agencies or individuals that are involved in that process, all those kind of things. And so we were reflecting on all of this at the beginning of 2017. And as we were, sort of the same week actually, we were introduced to a Kenyan bus driver in Qatar. And he was 1 year into a contract when we met him. He just really started to tell us about his own journey from rural Kenya into work in Doha. And the thing, he started telling us all different parts of his journey, and over several weeks we got to know that he'd experienced really everything you would hope somebody wouldn't. He'd heard about a job from in his hometown that was coming up in the Gulf. They wanted experienced bus drivers. He had the qualifications. He wanted to try something different, and over about 3 months, he started to apply for and do what he needed to do to go for this job. He, as he got further and further through the process, he'd spending more and more. So started to pay money for his visa. I think it cost him $1,000 when it should have only cost him $50. Like big difference in what it should have been and what it was. He was trying to find out information about the job and about the country, and he said, I just really couldn't find, whether by design or otherwise, I just couldn't find what I was looking for. When he went for his final job application or interview, I should say, it was in Nairobi. He had to pay quite a lot to get from his hometown to get there in the first place. And he said when he showed up, he thought it was at the recruiter's office, but it was at a primary school with 150 other applicants, all applying for the same job, a handful of jobs. He said when he got into the interview, the only thing they asked him was how much money did he have on him that day, as to whether or not he was going to go to the next stage or not. And he said, I couldn't go back, and I could only give them what I had that day and keep moving forward. When he signed a 2-year job offer before he left Kenya. When he arrived in Qatar, that 2-year offer was replaced with a 5-year contract, which by that stage he'd paid even more for flights and so on. He said that the job itself was very different to what he had expected. He didn't realize it was going to be for a school, which meant starting sort of at 3:30 in the morning, working very early to get around the different locations. Didn't know about the heat in Qatar. Didn't know about his accommodation. He said, when you think of accommodation, you probably don't think about where I live. He said, I'm in a camp way outside the city. So with living in a room with 7 other guys, our bunks are just around the edges of the room. We all live out of our backpacks. And so he was just telling us all of this journey. And he said, the thing is, even with everything I've experienced, I wouldn't tell somebody thinking of coming here not to come. because even with what I've experienced, compared to no job or a bad job in Kenya, this could still be the best thing for them and their family. But he said the thing is, I would want them to be able to make the decision I didn't get to make, because he said I thought I was choosing something, but what I ended up with was something very different. And
yeah, I mean, that
so
story,
that was
that's a great story in the sense that, you know, all those touch points, all those, you know, all the vulnerabilities add to the complexity of the scenario, and at each of those points just touch points of exploitation, an opportunity to be ripped off or misled or deceived, or someone's going to take advantage of you simply because of your lack of knowledge of the culture, the way things work, expectations for workers. All those kind of factors can all just feed into ending up like a choose your own adventure scenario where you just don't know where you're going to end up at the end of the day. Okay.
Yeah, and I think for that for us, I think really cemented understanding around modern slavery, and that it's not necessarily slavery as we think of it historically. We've got one person who's out to exploit and really put somebody in a bad situation. That still definitely happens. But probably the majority of how people end up in modern slavery now is through things like in the recruitment process, where you've just got so many individuals involved, all taking a small cut, all doing something that is not quite 100% above board, that leads to ultimately the individual themselves being in a situation like this Kenyan guy that he just had no way back, and he then had debt he had to repay. He told us actually he'd tried a couple of times in that first year to return to Kenya just for short trips for family medical emergencies, things like that, and was told by his employer he couldn't go because he hadn't repaid his training costs, which he didn't know he was having to repay. So there's lots of different things that all add up to a situation that somebody shouldn't be in.
Right. And contrary to a sort of more Hollywood portrayal of trafficking, for example, often modern slavery scenarios occur through opportunism gone sour, a series of choices, risks to step into new situations, and finding yourself in situations where you're compromised, your safety's compromised, or you're compromised financially, or from a work perspective. And this is very much a common sort of tale of what actually it looks like for many workers. Okay, so that's the really the why for Just Good Work, and it's just great to see that all that research, and it's really a great example, I suppose, of research that really just goes into I suppose for a commercial purpose, really, or goes to, or is has an application for it to actually help people in a tangible way. So maybe we could just I suppose run through Just Good Work and what it is, and how it benefits both workers who are maybe at risk in terms of the work they're looking for, but also it also has a component for those at the top end, for corporates and those who are looking down the supply chain. You have some slides if you want to bring them up, and we can then just sort of you can take people through what it looks like. It's good to have a bit of a visual, not just talking heads.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, saves. So, indeed, that's a good thing for us both. So all of those kind of conversations with this Kenyan bus driver, as well as lots of others in Kenya and Kenya, Uganda, and in Qatar. We spent time in Doha and in Kenya, getting to know other people's stories and journey, and all of that kind of led to Just Good Work, which came back to what we'd heard in the beginning, giving people a way to know what's okay and what's not okay at every stage of their recruitment and their employment. So trying to take a lot of the uncertainty and mystery out of what was a very opaque process, and trying to make it more transparent. And so looking at from when somebody is first starting to look at a job, through their recruitment, into their time at work overseas, to when they return home, helping them think about what issues to look out for along the way, helping educate them on their rights and responsibilities, but also connecting them with points of help. So the partnerships thing, again, really working with local organizations at home and abroad, to help make sure that people can get help at any stage where they might need it as well. So it began in Kenya and Uganda for workers going to Qatar, but then very quickly we started to adapt it for UAE and Saudi Arabia, adding other countries in the Gulf shortly as well. But then over time, have started to adapt it for the UK. So for home countries from Eastern Europe, for example, for Malaysia, for lots of home countries where workers are coming from all around South Asia into Malaysia for work. So there's lots of different routes that people are traveling for these jobs in different parts of the world. And I guess it's trying to make this information relevant for them and their particular journey. So there's lots of nuances around everything from visas to contracts to, like I said, about the cultural things. What does going from Nepal to Malaysia, what are the differences from Kenya to the Gulf? Even we heard from workers things like, there's things you can do in Kenya and Uganda, and you might get a slap on the wrist. Right. But if you do those same things in Qatar or UAE, it'll be slightly more than that. So it's just not. So it's looking at all of those different things that, and it's the same even for me as a Kiwi living in the UK. There were so many things when I moved here that I didn't know or didn't think I needed to think about. And so it's trying to help somebody through that decision making, know what to expect and know, okay, is this life, is this work really what's going to be good for me and my family? Maybe another way of looking at it is kind of this, on the left, we have all the things before you leave home, and on the right, when you arrive or you're in a new country. So the app, and the reason we developed it as an app is that somebody can have all this information with them regardless of, so it's all available offline. They have it regardless of where they are at in the journey. It includes things like questions to ask recruiters, contract and documentation advice, what costs particularly to look out for, because it's really the costs that lead to debt bondage. And I mean, the main reason that people often go for work overseas is to send money back to family. So if the costs are more than what you think, or your salary is less, or all of those things then mean you may actually end up just spending time away from your family to repay debt rather than providing for your family. So and a big part of that as well is prompting people throughout that early stages to take pictures of receipts or of any evidence of their contract or what they'd signed. So for example, with this Kenyan guy in Doha, when the laws started to change in Qatar a couple of years after we met him, he was able to show that he'd signed a 2-year job offer in Kenya because he'd thought to take a picture of it on his phone. And that meant that this 5-year contract was null and void. But he's definitely the exception. Unfortunately, most people don't have that evidence or things to help them. And it looks at when you arrive in a new country, what to do from when you arrive, what to expect, what living and working will look like, even how to access places of worship or leisure stuff to do outside of work. Often in the Gulf, for example, people are living in worker camps. They might have very limited access out to certain shops or that kind of thing. So just making that as accessible as it can be, and trying to help share stories of others who've been through that same journey, trying to make it personal for people. It's the stories really that people have told us they connect with most in Just Good Work. And that makes sense when I think unfortunately, there's a lot of stigma that's associated with this as well. So often people don't tell their story or their experience. So people think, they've gone overseas, they've had a really successful experience, they've come back. But then they know as well, unfortunately, in East Africa especially, that there's friends and family who simply don't come back, or who do come back changed and not in a good way. And
there might be social pressure to say that you had a good time, to say otherwise may not be helpful. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So so within the app, then we try to make this information as really what often is in legal or on government websites or things that are hard to access, trying to bring all of that in one place to make it as simple and accessible as possible. We're constantly trying to change and improve this, so we're going through a whole rework even of what you see here now, trying to make it more story-led and more visual, but making it in people's own language. So I think it's 15 languages now that JustGoodWork is in, and the different routes that we saw earlier. Make sure that for people, they can, I guess, and this is where it starts to lead into the transparency piece for companies and others, is we use inline questions. So the middle screenshot there, you can see hidden underneath the thumbs up a little bit is some of the questions that, just as people are going through their journey, they can respond to what is or isn't happening to them in that moment. So I guess JustGoodWork boils down to what should and shouldn't be happening, and trying to understand what is or isn't happening for somebody in that process, because that's where the transparency comes from, is trying to see, if a lot of people are experiencing being charged an excessive fee or being given wrong contract information or those kind of things, then that can all help companies, the agencies they work with, even their engagement with governments and others, better target where people are vulnerable and trying to drive change faster. That's kind of that's the aim. And so then finally you have things like, in the UK, for example, we have short video clips, and again in people's own language to help them through different stages. And then, like I said, connecting them with these points of help or advice wherever they need it.
So I gather from what, I can imagine then you would need a system for updating information, because obviously to keep it current, relevant, accurate is important. I really like the feature around being preemptive to be preventative. So prompting alerts or inline questions in order to then prevent certain things from happening, or bringing the awareness as a person's actually doing the journey in the country. That's great.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for and we'll talk about it a little bit as companies start to look at that, but a lot of the way that part of that prevention is helping people connect with JustGoodWork from really from the earliest stages of their journey, because I guess that's where they're most vulnerable, is where they first hear about this job. In Kenya and Uganda, people receive random text messages from people saying, there's a job available in Dubai or in Doha, apply now, that kind of thing. But when you receive a message like that, when there's no hope or opportunity of any work around you, then you're gonna go for that. So so having this kind of pocket guide, and I'm showing the UK example maybe because that's closest to Australia, but of course all of this kind of material and outreach looks very different in every country that it happens in. But I guess often, so we try to connect with, particularly through faith communities, or in East Africa through student unions or different sports community groups, whatever the places are that people connect with in their communities, where they already have a high level of trust or engagement, and that's sometimes through local NGOs or others as well. Trying to help people. It's not so much. The app is a tool to help them talk about or share about that information, but just making sure that these kind of conversations are happening and the stories are getting shared. But then trying to drive that those responses. So we send messaging updates out as well through the app. So anybody who's got it installed, especially during COVID or things like that, they can get instant updates on what's changing, what they need to know. And again, in those messaging updates, we can get them to share quickly what is or isn't happening for them in that moment as well. So it's just really, rather than sort of big surveys or other things that are trying to get people's experience, it's just getting them to respond really quickly to what's happening around them. And that goes from the early stages all the way through their place of work. And this is where I think companies are finding it especially helpful, is that they can understand that end-to-end experience of people coming into and out of different parts of their supply chain in real time. And that's really enabling them to try and prevent, like you said, prevent a lot of the issues that mean that they're then having to re-recruit workers or those kind of things. Actually, it's maybe worth just saying quickly. So for companies, I guess reducing that whole onboarding, training, orientation costs, so they can include things like custom employee handbooks or other things that make it then even more specific to their factory or to their place of operation. And so it's that whole preventing the issues for the worker, but preventing the management time and cost and all the other inefficiencies that come from those problems for the company as well.
So I mean, so as I suppose as a grievance mechanism, in some ways, it really bridges the gap between a buyer or consumer at the corporate end, workers, whether or not those workers are going from one jurisdiction to another that's foreign to the head office of the company, or they're, say, going from a place in Africa or Eastern Europe or maybe South Asia into the UK. So there's lots of different ways in which it can interact and can be used and for companies. And then companies can, I suppose, maybe explain this, can white label this app for their own use. How does that work?
Yeah. I guess so. As you say, that I guess that customization or making it specific for their supply chain can take on lots of different forms. So everything from their employees entering just a company or a factory code in the app, which means they download and they use the main JustGoodWork app, but they can unlock some company specific information. So, like I said, that pre-departure or orientation training. Some of the factories in Malaysia that we work with, they want to include things around accommodation or specifics about the job, so that they know then that their agents, because they're working closely with their agencies in Malaysia and Nepal, they know then that somebody who's applying for a job linked to their factories, that they've been given the right information about what the work is going to be, what the accommodation is going to be like, all the kinds of questions and issues they end up unpicking after the fact. It's that getting that specific there. But as you say, companies can also white label it, so they can. That means it uses the same technology, can even use some of the same content, but just branded and often more specific, especially for grievance mechanisms. So where they have their own whistleblowing or support process, we can integrate that into the app, or indeed integrate JustGoodWork with their applicant tracking or onboarding systems, contract, right to work checks. There's lots of different sort of company specific aspects that they can include in this app and make it something that's that feels like it's from them for their workers. Does it make sense?
Great, perfect, great. So obviously there's a lot involved in maintaining an app. There's ongoing research. There's need to keep information current, relevant, right for workers. How does is this? Do workers pay for this app? How do they access it? And how does the financial side of the application work?
Yeah. All good questions and all very true. So we wanted, I guess we set up JustGoodWork to be a tool that was both for companies and workers. So in the case of workers, they absolutely, it's freely and widely available. They don't pay anything to use it. And I guess the reason for that is that we want it to be available to as many people who need it as possible. So don't want cost to be a barrier for them. And similarly, that's also to encourage companies to share the free version of the app with their staff. So in the UK, lots of different labour providers, industry bodies, and so on, they promote the app to their workforce. There's no cost to them for doing so. But wherever JustGoodWork is, it then becomes a free tool for companies and workers alike to make use of in that way. The way that it then is sustained or funded is through companies doing this customization. So making use of it specifically for their own supply chain or workforce. Along with being able to include that custom information for workers, they can then completely customize all of the messaging, use it as a messaging tool. And actually for a lot of companies, that saves them on messaging costs alone, where they're having to pay for individual SMSs or outreach through WhatsApp or other channels. They're able to access a dashboard that gives responses to things like the checklists or the inline questions, the spot questions through the messaging. So they get that live visibility and even comparability across their supply chain if they want that. So really that's what companies are then paying for. And in some cases, it's not just companies, it's industry bodies or industry watchdog kind of organizations that want to have this kind of minimum standard for their industry. And so they pay to include very industry specific or again have that comparability across an industry in terms of the data and information that's coming back from the app.
Right. So, I mean, the app is growing. It's I've tracked its growth over the last 2 years. There's been a lot of work now done in Malaysia, for example. Do you have an indication of how many workers are using the application at this point? Yeah,
so it's kind of it's a combination really of those who directly download and use the app, but also I mentioned we do the kind of the community focused outreach. So that happens through particularly during COVID through online only, as well as through the other community groups, but we can track the numbers more easily through the online outreach through Facebook and things. So all the same messaging and information is going out through groups of, say, Kenyans in Qatar or Romanians in the UK. So for the app, we have around 5,500 users who download and actively use the app. In terms of when you then add the things like the Facebook outreach, often those messages are going to around 20,000 or more users, sometimes less, sometimes more than that. So it depends a lot on the region and the type of connection, but that's the kind of numbers of people that are using it. As you say, often the outreach is not just getting the information to people, but those online communities are real sources of insight into what's the real issues that people are facing in that moment as well, because they're quite happy to talk about them on groups of Romanians in the UK or Kenyans in Doha, just quite happy to talk as most you see through anything online really. People are always willing to share their opinion, and so it's a really that kind of insight though is really helping that live feedback for companies and others as well. So in the midst of COVID or Brexit, what stuff is changing day by day or not that should be changing for people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, yeah, it's an app. I mean, we're currently at Unchained. We're looking to integrate JustGoodWork into the Australian landscape, particularly given the work that's been done in Malaysia, which is very relevant to Australian companies, where the majority of products are sourced from Southeast Asia. I think there's a lot of scope there for companies to integrate Just Good Work into their grievance mechanism frameworks and processes. Yeah, look, it's been really insightful. Every time I talk to you about Just Good Work, I learn more about the application. We will obviously take questions from the main session after this recording, but just if people want to contact you directly, how can they do that? Quintin, to talk further.
Yeah, I think maybe if we can pop some contact bits up at the very end, but if on the website, so for Just Good Work, if you go to just JustGoodWork, that's the quickest way to get in touch. There's some contact details at the bottom of the pages, so JustGood.work, and you can see a little bit more about the app, but also even just the story of there's a video on there as well of some of the early story and more of what that picture looks like in Kenya and Qatar, just if you want to get to know it a little bit more. Yeah. So yeah.
Great. Well, Quintin, we really appreciate your time today. Thanks for joining the Unchaining Modern Slavery webinar, for sharing about the work of FiftyEight. The great research you've done, which I hope can continue and pick up in a hopefully an increased post-COVID world. Although it's I think it's still early days in many ways. And also for the work that you're doing with Just Good Work, we really look forward to seeing this application go viral, so to speak, and seeing so many more workers improve their situations, help them in their journey, have a more informed experience in looking for work abroad in different parts of the world. So yeah, we thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thanks so much. No, really appreciate you having me, and you likewise. You guys keep going well with everything you're doing there in Australia. We've been really love getting to work with and talk with you on all this stuff, and likewise learning so much from you as you go too. So just keep going well, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. All right, we'll talk soon.
All right, cheers, Steve.